Are you struggling to come up with original content week in and week out? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients, let them talk about what they care about most, and never run out of content ideas again. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome. This is Samantha Stone, your host of Authenticity in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And today we have an incredible author with us, and we're going to dive in and talk about some really important things that are impacting how we think about automation and artificial intelligence and all these incredible technologies that are now available to us. Welcome, Bill Ammerman.
It's nice to be with you, Samantha.
I am so glad that you're with me. And I just want to let our listeners know that after the show, if they're looking for your book, because they should, The Invisible Brand is fantastic. They look for Bill Ammerman. It won't come up because you are listed as William as the author. So I just want to let them know that. And I'm curious why you have decided to do that. Let's get a little bit behind your psychology of that. I always like to know why people like to be called different things.
My mom called me Billy. I changed that to Bill. And then when I got into the corporate world, everybody started abbreviating my first initial last name as Wammerman, W. Ammerman. I have a brother, Dave, and a brother, John. So we're Wammerman, Dammerman, and Jammerman. And in the digital age, having a vowel for the first letter of your last name helps because it makes it into a word. So anyway, Wammerman.com is my author site. It's where you can find information about the book and more information about me. But, Wammerman became my Instagram handle and my YouTube handle. So keeping with Wammerman, William makes more sense to people so that they understand the connection.
I love it. And I think your brother, John, with Jammerman might have gotten the best, all of those combinations there. I know my musician son would love that.
Absolutely. He was who I was with at Jazz Fest this week. So he was jamming as Jammerman.
I love it. I love it. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the book. It's called The Invisible Brand, Marketing in the Age of Automation, Big Data, and Machine Learning. So for those folks who have not yet read the book, because it's hot off the presses, and I feel fortunate I had a chance to take a look at it before it went live. Tell us about The Invisible Brand. What does that mean to you?
So the name is derived from the idea of the invisible hand. So Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations back in 1776. And when he did, he coined the phrase, the invisible hand. And in liberal economics, that has come to represent a force in the economy, whereby people participating in the free market invisibly create value for the larger market. And as I was writing the book, someone made the comment that it's like the invisible hand, this force that I was trying to define. And I thought really hard about it. I thought, well, that's interesting. Invisible hand. What marketing term rhymes with hand? And I thought about invisible advertising, invisible, corporations. And then, of course, right between the eyes, brand was sitting there. And I got excited about the title because what I wanted to do was help people see something that's invisibly operating in their lives. And I use the term brand very broadly. So it's not just corporate brands that are using artificial intelligence to influence us. It's government, it's politicians, it's political parties, it's institutions. So as we think broadly about brands, there are a lot of these forces that are operating on us socially using technology like artificial intelligence. And I wanted to start to help people see that, to make the invisible visible.
Well, I'm really glad that you did. And I think it's really important. I think, look, marketing has always been designed from its onset to influence someone to do something, whether that's influence somebody to buy something, to think a certain way, to have empathy, to get frustrated, whatever those things may be. But the technologies available to us today make it easier to influence things in ways that person might not be aware of, that we might not be recognizing as influence. It may not be as obvious that it's an advertisement. It may not be as obvious to us that someone is editorializing. And so personally, I think these technologies have the power to do incredibly powerfully good, positive things, but they also have the risk of doing very challenging things to us and how we think. And one of those challenges is eroding trust, that people have started to worry that I don't know what is real. I don't know what is fake. I don't know what is good. I don't know what is bad. How do we as consumers, as shoppers, as marketers, as business leaders address that issue of trust?
Trust has become a major theme in privacy. It's become a major theme in news and media. And I think that consumers do have a lot of skepticism about what's happening. And I think that starts with the recognition that information is becoming personalized, that you are being, persuaded by information that is tailored to your tastes and habits. And honestly, to, think about it in terms of our likes, we are consuming information that we like. It's not necessarily information we need. It's information that we like, and we are filtering out information that we don't like. And I started to learn about this a long time ago as I was starting to work, decades ago in digital media. Started to recognize that advertising could be delivered based on someone's wants and preferences. But we are way beyond that. We have reached the point now where your Facebook feed is different than my Facebook feed. The information you consume is tailored for you. The information I consume is tailored for me. It's influenced by the people we know. It's influenced by the brands we follow and what we buy. And so we're now at a point where we are isolating ourselves from information that we don't like. It used to be, when I graduated college, we lived in a broadcast world. We all received the same television signal at the same time. We all received the same radio broadcast at the same time. The New York Times, ran the same story on the front page for everybody. And today, when we go consume media, we're consuming information that is tailored to our wants and preferences. Now, on one hand, that can be good. It can prevent us from being bogged down by information that we're not interested in. But on the other hand, we have to realize that people are telling us what we want to hear. And we don't always benefit from just hearing what we want to hear. Sometimes we need to hear the bad news too. And by isolating ourselves from other ideas, other people's opinions, other ways of looking at things, we're narrowing our perspectives, and we're opening ourselves up at the same time to the influence of filter bubbles and the influence of echo chambers. And there's real profound dangers in all of that. So when we think about trust, we have to recognize that, one, we trust things instinctively that we like. We tend to self-select information that confirms our biases. We tend to consume information that is being spoon-fed to us because of our preferences. And at the end, we have to recognize that trust can also lead us in the direction of isolating ourselves from ideas that broaden us, that strengthen our understanding. So trust is a very complicated issue as we delve deeply into kind of filter bubbles and information personalization. And that's a big theme of the book. So the personalization of information is a foundational idea. It's this notion that information is being channeled to us based on our wants and desires. And ultimately, that's going to have a big influence on how people perceive the world around them.
You have a quote in the book, and I'm going to read this so I get it correct, which says, "Our religious impulse leaves us vulnerable to being hacked by the invisible brand." And I thought, when I first read that, I took a step back and I thought, I'm not a very religious person. I'm a fairly spiritual person, but I don't follow a specific religion. And so at first I thought, I'm not sure that applies to me. And then I realized that this is actually a much bigger concept. And this is a much bigger thing, which you've just been talking about, which is all of our impulses to find things that verify and validate the things that we like or make us feel good are reflected in a lot of the systems that we go out right now that are servicing us like things, right? Sort of this notion of confirmation bias, which is, for those who aren't familiar with it, I'm going to my Netflix login, and my Netflix login looks really different than my 16-year-old son, than my husband, than my 20-year-old. And the reason they all look so different is they're serving up to the best of their ability the things that they think I'm going to like. And most of the time, what they serve is very valuable, and I do enjoy. They actually do a pretty good job of it. However, I routinely will watch Netflix with my children or my husband because they'll expose me to things that I also like that I haven't seen come up in my feed. So how do we as marketers in particular, or as leaders who control communications output that are building these types of systems, resist the temptation to serve people only the things that we know for certain they're going to feel good about? Or maybe I've made an assumption and we shouldn't resist that temptation. Let's start there. Should we resist that temptation, or should we feed it?
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. And one of the challenges in writing the book was I had to decide what audiences I was writing for. One, I'm writing for the marketing practitioner, but I'm also writing for the general audience who are being influenced by these technologies. And, I think the answer comes down to ethics, and it's a matter of us as marketing professionals acting ethically. I'm going to circle back to your comment about religion. So religion, many people believe that the etymological root of religion, is, it shares the concept of connecting, like ligaments. So when we think of it's to do it again, and ligare or a ligament is something that reconnects. And so when we think about religion, we're not necessarily we note that there isn't the word God in the word religion. It's not deus. Deus isn't in the root. So we're talking about things that connect us. And our media culture has become something very powerful in terms of connecting us with each other. And when we think about the power of our media culture to persuade us and to connect us, we have to really understand that it's connecting us in a way that some people have described as religious. In the past, that thing that connected a group of people or a society was their religion. And today, that connection oftentimes comes in the form of our social media. So when we think about the religious impulse, our desire to connect with one another, that desire to connect with one another can be hacked. I'm very profoundly convinced that that's true, that it can be used to persuade us both for good and for bad. And insofar as we use that to persuade people ethically, to persuade people toward good behaviors, toward healthy behaviors, it's a good thing. And so I'll give you an example of that so that, we're not just talking about scaring people and making us all Luddites. What we're really looking for are opportunities to improve people's, lives and experiences. So imagine, I use this in the book as an example, but imagine we invented a pair of shoes that had a bunch of sensors in them, and that the sensors in those shoes could help detect changes in the way you walk. Well, changes in the way you walk might be indicative of disease, of Parkinson's. People with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, they change the way they walk. Your feet are often an early indicator of disease like diabetes, which affects the extremities, particularly the feet, early. So maybe if we crowdsource information, gather information from lots and lots and lots of people, millions of people wearing shoes with these sensors in them, we gather all that information, we might find ways to detect disease earlier. We might find ways to help people identify diabetes earlier so that it can be treated. Wouldn't it be great if we could, gather information from people's wearable technology and then turn that information into persuasive messaging that helped them avoid critical mistakes in their diet or their healthcare or their behaviors, and persuade them towards more healthy behaviors. I think we can all agree that that would serve the greater good for society. But I think we also have to be conscious that, technology powerful enough to measure measure changes in your walk and changes in, your feet is technology that gives people insights into your body and the life stages that you're in that they could potentially use against you. And so when we talk about this stuff, one of the profound messages I'm trying to put forth in the book is that we have to behave ethically and consumers have to understand the technology so that they can protect themselves. And I think those two things come hand in hand in the book, informing marketers and helping them see how to use technology ethically, but at the same time, sharing the strategies and the techniques with the general public so that we can see the invisible and we can have a conversation, publicly about what's happening and how it's changing us as individuals.
You have a chapter that's at least in part about privacy. And you sort of touched on that right now, which is the collection of this information can do this incredibly powerful thing. It's actually a wonderful example. I have a father-in-law who unfortunately has suffered from dementia. He ended up needing to live with us for a while and now is ultimately in a nursing home. But we think for a while before that happened, he probably was showing signs of degrading that we weren't noticing. We didn't live with him. We didn't know. We weren't noticing those things. And we might have noticed if he had fallen more often on his walk, for example. So it's a really great example to me personally as I think about a loved one and the situation and the care that they received and how we might have intervened sooner. I'm also sensitive to the fact that I think about, oh my goodness, they could have taken that information and his health insurance rates could go up because he's suffering from something, or, any number of ways that might be used to, he could be hacked into and seen as vulnerable by thieves, or security systems. All kinds of things could happen. So how do we think about privacy in a world now where we're not just collecting your name and address, we're collecting information that is deeply relevant to your life and relevant to making decisions, but also deeply personal. And I, for one, don't want to be a person who just shuts down the world and says, I'm going to give nothing to nobody because I am afraid I'm going to throw out my Echo. I'm going to not use a Nest sensor. I'm going to turn every camera off in my house. I don't want that paranoia. I want to use the technology that can be helpful, but that balance of privacy is real. How do you guide readers to think about this, and what are some things that we should be doing differently now than we have done in the past?
My 22-year-old daughter received an Amazon Echo from her brother for Christmas, and she plugged it in. And there was a conversation happening around the dinner table about what people were doing for the evening. And I said to my daughter, Kate, I said, be careful, Alexa is listening. And at that moment, Alexa perked up and said, go ahead, I'm listening. And my daughter, with this startled, terrified look on her face, walked over and immediately unplugged it. So, that's kind of the reality that we are being monitored is, terrifying to a lot of people. We carry around mobile phones in our pockets. And when people ask me, I say, please understand you are carrying around a microphone that is plugged in to the internet. The fact that Alexa can hear her name spoken should indicate to you that she is listening. She's listening all the time. She only wakes up when you say Alexa, but she's constantly listening.
So I don't know if you could hear that, but my Alexa just went off because she was listening to our conversation just now. Please continue.
Right. I woke up Alexa. Right. And so you got to go unplug your Alexa. And the reality is we're being listened to, and what we say as we enter into a culture where we're having communications, we're speaking to our technology. Voice is a very persuasive medium. Not only can we persuade people with our voices, but we have to understand that the voices speaking back to us through our technology can use voice because it's human-like, it's anthropomorphic. It connects with us at a very deep level. We learn to speak when we are 1.5 years old. We don't learn to read until we're 4 or 5 years old. And so when we look into, kind of the depth of our relationships with our technology, speech and the ability to talk and listen to people and what they say to detect their emotional state, to detect what they're really seeking, to understand their motives. That's opening up a huge new realm of information that people don't really associate. That you named, we know your name and your address and your telephone number, but knowing that you're angry, or knowing that you're happy, or knowing that you're emotionally engaged with your Alexa device, that's a completely different level of information. And you asked, where do you find the balance, or how do you help people understand that? Well, that's a big part of why I wrote the book. But, oftentimes it's just a matter of helping people see how the data and information is collected, and making sure they're aware that they are trading that for something, and making sure that people understand, I'm trading my privacy in order to, have things, delivered to my home easily, or in order to, find directions to a specific, Thai restaurant. So there's a trade-off. And as long as people are aware of what they're trading, and they're capable of making a fair decision, I think that ethically we're okay. Where it becomes dangerous is, like the experiments that China's going through, where they're building kind of a social rating system based on your behaviors, and they're giving you access to transportation and housing in exchange for what they consider positive behaviors. And I'm reminded of the old saying that, somebody that's powerful enough to give that to you is also powerful enough to take it all away. And so if you can be controlled down to using information as a coin of commerce, literally, it's, your social profile becomes the means by which you can purchase transportation and housing and a good job. When you realize that that's the coin or the currency that you're using to purchase those things, you also recognize that somebody who doesn't like what you're saying could come in, lower your score, and now prevent you from accessing all of that information, or all of those services. And that's very scary to me. That is where I have to say, big red flag. That is a big problem globally that we're all going to have to address sooner than later.
Frankly, that terrifies me. As much as I love the potential of doing really incredible things for me, that experiment in particular, and anything like that, it can fundamentally shift how we as humans communicate, how we as humans operate, and provide a level of control that is very hard to imagine anybody using well in the long term, right? You can look at little experiments of things. I can look at things in the short term, and I can see, in that circumstance, it's okay, but there is that fine line. Do you believe that regulation, will be the way that we protect ourselves from this? Or do you think it's going to have to be something different than that helps us as a society and as a global economy address these kinds of concerns?
So thought leaders like, Tim Berners-Lee have talked about a Magna Carta for the internet. And, they are a lot of very smart people working on strategies for, making personal information something that is almost a human right, that you would have the right to your own personal information. The challenge comes is that, what affects me and my personal information also affects someone else. So it becomes a challenge of where you draw the line. If I walk into your store and I buy dog food, you now know, I'm your customer, and I own a dog. Well, are you allowed to have that information? I would think most people would say yes. That's fundamental to the relationship we just created. I'm your customer, and as your customer, you're allowed to know that I own a dog and I buy dog food at your store. So, so we have this challenge, which is, okay, if information about me is a human right, if my personal information and my privacy is a human right, where do I draw the line between what are my personal information, what's my personal information, and what is someone else's? Someone could make the argument that as the store owner, information about your store, about your business, is your privacy right, is your right to information about you. And therefore, you have this overlap, this gray area of information that you have the right to, and I have the right to. And, as we go down and we start parsing that, it gets very complex very quickly. So trying to figure out what information is, my personal information and what information is somebody else's right is complicated. If I'm driving on a public highway, is my location my private information? Well, if so, I might be invisible to a self-driving car and I might get killed in a car accident. So my location might be something that somebody else needs. And if we hide that from technology, I might end up in a car accident. So, is my information about where I am at this given moment public or private? So again, we get into this gray area. If I'm driving on a public highway, I don't really want the world broadcasting the fact that Bill Ammerman is driving from point A to point B. I'm a little sketched out by the idea that somebody might be broadcasting that information. But at the same time, I want my car to be detected if there's a self-driving vehicle coming in the other lane. I want some information about my location to be relevant to other drivers. So again, we are in a very challenged position in terms of how to regulate privacy. Let me say one other word about regulation. Regulation is often terms brought up in the context of regulating and even breaking up some of these big entities, the Facebooks and the Googles. We broke up Ma Bell and broke it up into all these baby bells. And a lot of people default back to that. And I say that, that's a possibility. And I recognize that there are, well-minded, well-intentioned people who think that way. But I also think that in a world where, massive economies, China in specific, are growing up and using this technology, that, I want to sound a note of caution before we run off and break up the independent businesses that could become a bulkhead or some method of holding back the wave of big governments being able to control this technology. That we should recognize that in our free market system, we are holding some of the trump cards that we shouldn't just give those away by breaking up these conglomerates that have lots of different tools at their disposal. They could help us in the long term resist some of the most unethical practices by big governments. And I think that there's been a lot of pressure on Google not to succumb to some of the censorship rules that China is trying to impose. But the threat is very real that China could go out and literally start its own internet. And when we start to think that way, we have to recognize that our corporations, a lot of these American corporations, could become our best ally in the long term in protecting, people broadly against the abuses of big government. Very complicated. I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of the practices, that are being deployed to persuade people. But at the same time, I recognize that in the long term, we may be in a better position by having them versus the darkest alternatives.
This is complicated and this is not an easy thing to solve, just like things like DNA manipulation and some of the medical technologies that are available to us today are not easy to always discern what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. But I do think, and I know we're sort of running out of time here, but I do think that it's important for our listeners, particularly those that are marketers and business leaders, and even just consumers, to take responsibility to understand this. We may not be able to solve this on a global basis, you and I sitting here, Bill, and chatting about it, or their listeners sitting there in their boardrooms and in their offices and deciding what I'm going to do nowadays, but we contribute to it, and we contribute to it in very important ways. And the better we can understand where things can be manipulated and where we can add value as a brand to people that we're reaching out to, I think it's our obligation to do that work, to think through it, to treat our data as sacred, and to treat the people that we serve not as people to be manipulated, but as people to drive value. And I do believe in my heart, and maybe I'm just too much of an optimist, but I believe in my heart that the brands that do this ethically, that do take the position of serving, that avoid dramatic manipulation techniques, in the end will win. That there may see exceptions and we'll see bursts of things happening that are not in the regard, but the durable businesses, the businesses that we want to be working for and with in 10 years from now and 20 years from now are going to understand this, and they're going to contribute to these things in important and positive ways. And lastly, as consumers, it's our job to be a little skeptical. And when we see things that don't feel right or feel like they plop on our laps, we should go out and, verify and validate and make sure that we as brands are making it easy for our consumers to do that. So I thank you. I think the book that you've written is incredibly important because whether you think it affects you right now or not, it does. And you provide some really important ways of thinking about this. Before I let you go, however, and our listeners go off looking to go buy the book, tell us a little bit about, maybe one of the other chapters in the book that is very meaningful to you, and a little bit about what readers might be able to get a taste of.
Yeah. So thank you for all of that. Very, very kind of you to say. So in a nutshell, I started off trying to write this big idea book and realized that in order to really help people the most, I needed to make it practical. And so it's a big idea book masquerading as a business book. And I say that poking fun at myself a little bit. But the reality is the first half of the book, which is called Emergence, is about the technologies. It's helping people understand at a very specific level how digital advertising technologies works, how the exchanges work, and how the personalization of information works. I take time to explore algorithms, and I take time to explain how all the math works. Now, that's not to say it's a book about math. It certainly isn't. It's just it's kind of a very high level explanation, almost as if you're reading Artificial Intelligence for Dummies, which was maybe a subtitle that I had considered at one point. So that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is called Synthesis, and it's where I bring these ideas together to show how the personalization of information, how persuasion as a science is influencing us, how machine learning is tying those things together so that we're now able to develop artificial intelligence systems that we can talk to, that learn how to persuade us using personalized information. And when you put all of that together, you realize there are huge implications for media, there's huge implications for marketing, but there are implications far beyond that in areas as diverse as finance and education, healthcare, and even the arts. So the second half of the book is where I tie all of the technologies together to demonstrate how they are being applied currently and where they can be applied in the future. And so if you're into technology, you might get really turned on by the first half of the book. If learning about algorithms doesn't excite you, the second half of the book, which is more about the applications of this technology, will really help you see and maybe generate new ideas about your own business, your own industry, because I really do think this technology, what we've developed, what started in kind of ad tech and marketing technology, has evolved into something much more powerful that's going to have a very broad influence on a lot of industries in the future.
I'm so glad that you sort of wrapped up on that, because I think we spent a lot of time talking about some of the risks associated with artificial intelligence. And the reason I did that is because I want us to, as marketers and business people, understand what our consumers are thinking. They have these fears, they have this mistrust. That is a very real thing. And I think we have the opportunity to show them all the good stuff that can happen. And that second half of the book helps map out and hopefully will inspire a lot of people to use these capabilities to do really incredible things, not just to sell our product, right? There's lots of ways to sell our product or our service, but to do good, right? To actually improve the way people even just use our product, right? So we can go beyond just, I got you to buy that bottle of wine, but now I'm going to give you a really great recipe now that I know the bottle is open to complement that wine you're about to drink, right? And all kinds of really useful applications of this technology that can help us just be better people, better partners with our customers. So thank you, Bill, so much for joining us. Why don't you go ahead again and just give out the URL where our listeners can find out more information about the book?
Yeah, the book is being published by McGraw-Hill. It is called The Invisible Brand, and you can find it on Amazon. The publishing date is May 24th, in stores June 14th, and you can learn more about it at my author site, which is my first initial, W for William, my last name, Ammerman, AMMERMAN.com. So Wammerman.com.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really important conversation. And our listeners, I encourage you to really learn this material. Even if this isn't part of your day-to-day job today, it is absolutely going to affect the way we work, the way we shop, the way we consume. Thank you, Bill, for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Samantha.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.